Clint Eastwood sat across from the smug liberal TV host, his piercing gaze unshaken. The host thought he had the upper hand, until Clint leaned forward, his voice like steel. "You think you can silence me? Think again." What followed was a takedown so brutal, so unforgettable, that the entire studio was left in stunned silence. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The crisp white envelope sat on Clint Eastwood's desk, stark against the dark wood. A silent challenge wrapped in a thin veneer of professionalism. Next to it, an old black coffee had long since gone cold, untouched as Clint stared at the invitation, his rugged hands resting on the table, his fingers lightly drumming against the surface. It was a formal request from one of the most watched liberal talk shows in America, a primetime spectacle hosted by none other than Michael Reynolds, a man infamous for his ability to bait, trap, and dismantle conservative guests. Reynolds had made a career out of humiliating those who dared to oppose his narrative, using his smug, condescending style to push his opponents into corners they couldn't escape. Clint let out a slow, measured breath, his piercing blue-gray eyes narrowing as he read the details. The network was expecting him to decline. It was the smart move. Avoid the trap, stay silent, let it pass. But something inside him stirred, something that refused to be caged. This wasn't just about him. This was about truth. For years, Hollywood had been shifting, turning into a machine that no longer valued freedom of speech or independent thought, but instead demanded submission, obedience, and the regurgitation of pre-approved opinions. The moment someone dared to challenge the mainstream narrative, the machine would turn on them, chew them up, and spit them out. Clint had seen friends and colleagues fold under pressure, forced to apologize for speaking their minds, their legacies tarnished by nothing more than refusing to bow down. That wasn't going to happen to him. A deep sigh left his lips as he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. At 93 years old, Clint had outlasted just about everyone who had ever tried to take him down. He had been in Hollywood long before most of these so-called activists were even born. He had survived war, not just on the big screen, but in life. He had seen governments fall, ideologies collapse, and men who thought they were invincible crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. And now they wanted to put him on trial for his beliefs? A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Let them try. His longtime friend and manager, Frank Delaney, stepped into the room, stopping just short of Clint's desk. Frank was a practical man, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He knew what this show was, knew exactly what kind of ambush awaited Clint on that stage. Folding his arms, he let out a sigh. "You don't have to do this, Clint," he said. "They're setting you up." Clint finally looked up, locking eyes with Frank, his expression unreadable. He had already made up his mind. "They think I'll back down," Clint said, his voice low and steady. "They think I'm scared." Frank let out a humorless chuckle. "They don't know you very well, do they?" Clint grabbed the invitation, tapping it against the desk. "No, they don't." Frank sighed again, but there was a glint of respect in his eyes. "All right," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But let's not kid ourselves. They're not inviting you to talk. They're inviting you to be their punching bag." Clint shrugged. "And they're in for one hell of a surprise." Outside, the sun was beginning to set over the Hollywood hills, casting a golden glow over the sprawling city that had once belonged to Clint. This town had changed. The industry had turned on its own, discarding legends the moment they stopped towing the line. But Clint didn't give a damn about Hollywood's approval. He reached for his coffee, took a sip, and winced. Cold. With a sigh, he tossed the invitation into the air, caught it between his fingers, and finally nodded. "Tell them I'll be there," he said. Frank studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I'll make the call." As Frank walked away, Clint turned back to the window, watching the sky darken. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what he was walking into. The trap was set, the cameras would roll, the audience would be stacked against him. But he wasn't walking into their lion's den to be slaughtered, and he was walking in to remind them who the real lion was. The battle was set. The interview would be one for the history books, and Clint Eastwood was ready. The night of the interview arrived like an impending storm. Outside the high-rise glass studio in Los Angeles, a crowd had already formed, some there in eager anticipation, others waiting for the chance to see Clint Eastwood fail. The media was hyping this event as the moment Hollywood's golden rebel was finally put in his place. Inside the studio, the air was thick with nervous energy. The producers moved like soldiers before a battle, checking cameras, adjusting lights, murmuring into their earpieces. Everything had been carefully orchestrated to put Clint on the defensive. The audience had been hand-picked, the questions pre-approved, and the man who would be firing those questions, Michael Reynolds, was sitting at his sleek black desk, flipping through his notes with a smirk. Reynolds had been in this game a long time. He had taken down politicians, CEOs, actors, and even a few former military generals, all with the same cocky, condescending tone. He wasn't just looking for a debate, he was looking for a moment, a clip that would go viral, where he would reduce Clint Eastwood to nothing more than an outdated, bitter old man clinging to a world that no longer existed. What Reynolds didn't know was that Clint wasn't coming to play defense. As Clint stepped onto the set, there was no hesitation, no nerves, no faltering steps. He walked with the confidence of a man who had spent decades commanding every room he entered, whether it was a Hollywood studio, a political event, or a battlefield set on the silver screen. The second he appeared, the audience reacted. A few cheers, mostly murmurs, some whispered conversations. They were waiting to see what he would do. Reynolds greeted him with a fake, polished smile as they shook hands. Clint felt the firm grip, the calculated squeeze meant to send a message. He didn't react. If Reynolds wanted to play games, Clint was more than happy to watch him lose. The two men took their seats, and just like that, the cameras went live. "Good evening, America," Reynolds said smoothly, addressing the audience like a ringmaster preparing for the show to begin. "Tonight, we have a very special guest, a Hollywood icon, a director, a former mayor, but most of all, a man whose opinions have sparked more than a little controversy." Clint remained stone-faced, watching Reynolds like a predator watches its prey. Reynolds leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his smirk widening. "Mr. Eastwood, let's start with the obvious question. Some say your views are, how should I put this, a little outdated, that you're clinging to a past that no longer reflects modern America?" There it was. The first attack, carefully disguised as a question. Clint exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, meeting Reynolds' gaze without blinking. Then, in that famous low, gravelly voice, he said, "You ever build anything, Michael?" The room went completely silent. Reynolds blinked. A house, a business, anything with your own hands?" Clint continued, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You ever wake up before dawn, put in the sweat, the hours, the time it takes to build something worth a damn?" Reynolds shifted in his seat, clearly thrown off. Well, I'm a journalist, Mr. Eastwood." Clint smirked. "A journalist? Right. So the only thing you've ever built is a career tearing down people who do." The audience stirred, a few muffled gasps. The producers in the control room started scrambling. Reynolds forced a chuckle. "Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, we're here to discuss your views, not mine." Clint leaned back. "That's right, my views, which, according to you, are outdated." He gestured around. "This studio, this network, this country, they were built by men and women who weren't afraid to work, who weren't afraid to fight for something real. You think principles expire? You think values have an expiration date?" Reynolds' smirk was fading. He wasn't expecting this. Clint shook his head. "Truth doesn't change, kid. Only people do." The tension in the studio was electric. Reynolds was fumbling, the polished, rehearsed attack falling apart in real time. But he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He took a deep breath, then forced a condescending smile. "Well, Mr. Eastwood, it's interesting you mention values, because some people argue that your support for a certain former president," he let the words hang in the air, letting the audience murmur, "suggests that maybe you're not as much about principles as you claim. Maybe, just maybe, you're just another Hollywood celebrity pushing an agenda." Clint's eyes flickered. There it was, the real attack. He tilted his head slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then he chuckled, a deep, knowing laugh that sent a chill through the room. "Let me tell you something, kid," Clint said, his voice dropping lower. "I've been in this town longer than you've been alive. I've seen actors come and go, politicians rise and fall. But you know what I've never seen?" Reynolds swallowed. "What's that?" Clint's eyes locked onto him. A man who stood for nothing and still won. The audience erupted. The control room went into full-blown panic. The producers were whispering frantically, trying to find a way to cut to commercial. But it was too late. Michael Reynolds had just realized the one thing he never expected. He wasn't interviewing Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood was dismantling him, live on national television. The studio was a battlefield now, but Michael Reynolds was too arrogant to realize he was already losing. He had invited Clint Eastwood here to be humiliated, to be backed into a corner and made to stammer his way through rehearsed gotcha questions. But this wasn't just another Hollywood actor sitting across from him. This was Clint Eastwood, a man who had spent his life standing tall in the face of challenges, in film, in politics, in war, in life itself. He had faced tougher men than Reynolds. Hell, he had outlived tougher men than Reynolds. And now, with the cameras rolling, he wasn't about to let some smug TV host rewrite the truth for millions of people watching at home. Reynolds, however, was too deep into his script to back down now. He shuffled his papers, pretending to scan his notes, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Now, Mr. Eastwood," Reynolds said, forcing a smirk, "you talk a lot about values and truth, but some people would say that you're just another privileged Hollywood elite playing a role, this tough guy persona. That doesn't really reflect the world we live in today?" Clint didn't blink. He didn't fidget or squirm the way other guests usually did when they were put under pressure. Instead, he studied Reynolds, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the host to start shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Then Clint chuckled. "Let me tell you something about privilege, kid." His voice was low, steady, cutting through the studio like a blade. Reynolds' smirk faltered slightly. Clint leaned forward. "Privilege isn't being born into money. It isn't getting a fancy education. Privilege is being able to sit in a chair like yours and talk down to people who built the world you're living in." The audience stirred. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, But Clint wasn't finished. He pointed toward the crew working behind the cameras. "You see those guys? The ones running the cameras, the lights, the sound? They get up at the crack of dawn and put in real work. They don't sit behind a desk, running their mouths for a paycheck. They don't hide behind pre-written questions, hoping to catch someone off guard so they can boost their ratings." The cameramen exchanged glances, some even smirked. Clint tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I respect them," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "You?" He let out a dry chuckle. "You're just another guy who gets paid to talk." The audience erupted into murmurs. Some of them, the ones who had been coached to boo and scoff at Clint, suddenly weren't so sure anymore. Reynolds, for the first time in his career, felt the air shifting against him. He licked his lips, glanced down at his notes, then forced a grin. "Well, Clint," he said, "you certainly have a way with words. But let's be honest here. The world is changing. America isn't the same place it was when you were younger. People today see things differently. They don't want to be ruled by the past." Clint exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a small, almost pitying smile. "You talk about the past like it's a bad thing," he said. "Like the people who came before us were somehow wrong because they didn't have Twitter accounts or corporate-sponsored activism." He leaned forward again, his gaze piercing through Reynolds. "The past isn't the enemy, Michael. Weak men are." The audience gasped. Reynolds stiffened, but Clint didn't give him time to recover. "You think America has changed?" "Sure. But let me ask you something, Michael." He tilted his head. "Has it changed for the better? Or just for the louder?" Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched. Clint let his words sink in before continuing, his voice even softer now, but somehow carrying even more weight. "You can tell yourself the world is better now. You can say that men like me are dinosaurs, that we don't understand modern values. But let me tell you what I do understand." He glanced around the studio, his weathered, lined face full of quiet authority. "I understand sacrifice." He pointed at Reynolds. "I understand that this country was built by men who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Men who didn't sit around complaining about how hard life was. They got up and made it better." A deep hush fell over the room. The audience, the crew, even the producers whispering in the control room. They were all listening now. Reynolds shifted again, trying to salvage his position. "Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it," he said, attempting to regain his smug demeanor. "But let's talk about the present. You've been vocal about certain political figures. Some say your support for past administrations proves that you're just another celebrity shilling for a party, just another actor pretending to be a politician." Clint's jaw clenched slightly. Reynolds leaned forward, pushing his advantage. "You built a career playing tough guys. Maybe that's all this is. Maybe you're just playing a role." That was it, the knockout punch he had been waiting to deliver. A few of Reynolds' loyal audience members snickered. The host's smirk widened. He thought he had cornered Clint. But then Clint did something no one expected. He laughed. A deep, genuine, from-the-gut laugh that echoed through the studio. Reynolds' face dropped slightly. This wasn't the reaction he was expecting. Clint shook his head, still chuckling. Then, when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. "Kid, I don't play a role." He looked directly into the camera. "I don't have to, because I know exactly who I am." Then he turned back to Reynolds, his expression dead serious now. "The real question is, do you?" Reynolds froze. The audience fell completely silent. The crew held their breath. And just like that, the entire studio felt the weight of a man who had just won a war without ever raising his voice. The tension in the studio was now a living, breathing thing. It clung to the air, thick and unshakable, wrapping itself around every person in the room like a vice. Michael Reynolds had walked into this interview expecting to break Clint Eastwood down, expecting to toy with him like a cat with a cornered mouse. Instead, he was the one trapped, and Clint was watching him like a hawk that had already decided how this would end. But Reynolds wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He was grasping for something, anything that could pull him out of the wreckage of this interview. His eyes darted toward his producers, who were frantically whispering into their headsets. The show was falling apart, and they knew it. Reynolds cleared his throat, trying to gather himself. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, forcing a grin, "you talk a lot about the past, about sacrifice, about men who built this country. But let's be real. Hollywood has given you everything: wealth, fame, power. So why are you playing the victim here? Why are you acting like you're the one who's been wronged?" Clint let out a slow exhale, shaking his head as if disappointed. "Kid," he said, his voice smooth as ever, "you think this is about me?" He leaned forward, locking eyes with Reynolds. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. "This isn't about me. This is about people like you. People who sit in these chairs, on these stages, in these studios, and pretend you're the ones calling the shots. Pretend you get to decide who's allowed to speak, what's allowed to be said, and what version of the truth people get to hear." Reynolds' fingers tightened around his pen, his grin now visibly forced. Clint kept going, his voice growing sharper now, more unshakable. "You sit there acting like the past doesn't matter, like everything that came before us should just be erased. But let me tell you something, son. Clint leaned back slightly, eyes still burning into Reynolds. If you don't respect where you came from, you won't survive where you're going. The audience stirred again, some nodding, others exchanging glances. Even those who had come into the show as Clint's critics, hand-picked by Reynolds' producers to stack the deck, were starting to waver. Reynolds, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat, but he wasn't done swinging. "Well, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice tighter than before, "if that's the case, then let's talk about something else. Let's talk about politics." He smirked again, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "You've never been shy about your political views, but some people would argue that you're just another celebrity trying to tell people how to think. Why should anyone listen to you?" Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, amusement lacing his words. Reynolds blinked. "Get what?" Clint leaned forward, his voice dropping low, dangerously low. "The difference between you and me?" Silence. Reynolds froze. Clint tilted his head, staring him down with a calm intensity that sent a chill through the room. "You get paid to talk. I get paid to tell the truth." The audience gasped. Reynolds swallowed hard. The cameras caught everything. His flicker of panic, the way his eyes darted to the side like a man looking for an escape route. But there was none. Clint continued. "You sit here, hiding behind scripts, teleprompters, and producers in your earpiece, thinking that makes you powerful. But let me ask you something, Michael." He gestured toward the audience. "If you had to stand in front of these people without your notes, without your cameras, without your talking points, who would you be then?" Reynolds had no answer. The silence was deafening. The producers were whispering frantically now, their voices sharp, panicked. This wasn't how the show was supposed to go. Reynolds was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to be the one tearing down Clint Eastwood, not the other way around. But the problem was simple. Clint didn't care about the rules of their game. Reynolds finally found his voice, though it wasn't nearly as strong as before. "You think you have it all figured out, don't you?" he said, his words laced with frustration. "That you're some kind of wise old cowboy with all the answers?" Clint smirked. "Nah, kid," he exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't have all the answers, but I know a fraud when I see one." The audience erupted, some in laughter, others in applause. Even the crew behind the cameras were stifling grins. Reynolds? He looked like a man drowning. But Clint wasn't done. "I don't sit here telling people how to think," he said. "I don't tell them what's right or wrong, but I'll tell you what I do believe." The room fell silent again. "I believe that people are smarter than you give them credit for. I believe they don't need you, or your producers, or some corporate overlord in a suit telling them what to believe." Reynolds' jaw clenched. Clint tilted his head slightly. "That scare you, Michael?" Reynolds forced out a dry laugh, trying to save face. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "You think you're some kind of rebel?" Clint's smirk grew. "No, son." He adjusted the microphone clip to his collar. "I think I'm free." Boom. Reynolds went stiff. The audience sat in stunned silence. The control room was in chaos. The producers were waving their hands, whispering into their earpieces, shouting into headsets. But none of it mattered, because Clint Eastwood had just exposed the entire game on live television. Michael Reynolds was unraveling before America's eyes. The sharp, smug host who had built his career on tearing people down was now the one being dismantled, piece by piece. His questions, once armed with venom, had lost their sting. His confidence, once unshakable, was now visibly cracking under the weight of Clint Eastwood's unwavering presence. But Reynolds wasn't about to go down without a fight. He forced a tight-lipped smile, gripping the edges of his desk like a man hanging onto control by his fingernails. His producers were screaming in his earpiece, desperate to steer the ship back on course. He could feel the heat of their panic, the chaos in the control room as they scrambled for anything, any angle, any attack that could flip this back in his favor. Reynolds took a deep breath and pivoted. Mr. Eastwood, he began, his voice carrying the forced calmness of a man trying not to choke, you've made it very clear that you have strong opinions about the direction of this country. But don't you think that maybe, just maybe, people like you, people who refuse to change, are the real problem? Clint raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. This was the best Reynolds had? You mean people like me who believe in things like honesty, hard work, and personal responsibility? Clint asked, his voice as steady as ever. People who don't bend every time a new trend tells them to? Yeah, I guess we are a problem. For people who don't like the truth? The audience stirred. Even Reynolds' most loyal viewers could feel it now. Clint wasn't just answering questions. He was turning the mirror on them all. Reynolds swallowed hard, but he wasn't done. He leaned in, feigning concern. Mr. Eastwood, let's be honest here. The world is moving forward. You're clinging to a past that doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it's time to accept that. Clint exhaled slowly, as if he were dealing with a child who didn't understand the lesson he was trying to teach. And then he smiled. It wasn't a smile of anger or mockery. It was the smile of a man who knew he had already won. Michael, Clint said, his voice softer now, but far more dangerous, let me tell you something about the past. Reynolds blinked. He wasn't prepared for this. You ever sit on a porch at sunset? Clint asked. Ever watch the sky turn gold, the light fade just slow enough that you can feel the warmth linger? That's the past. He leaned forward. The entire room was dead silent. The past isn't something you run from. It's not something you erase. It's something you learn from, something that keeps you grounded when everything around you is spinning out of control. Reynolds opened his mouth, but Clint wasn't finished. And let me tell you something else, Clint continued. His voice was firm now, unshakable. The people who built this country, the men who fought, who bled, who gave everything so you could sit here in your air-conditioned studio and lecture me about progress, those men didn't die so we could forget them. Reynolds visibly flinched. Clint shook his head, disgusted. You sit here telling me the world is moving forward. Forward toward what, Michael? Toward a place where people are afraid to speak their minds? Toward a country where being strong, being self-reliant, being willing to stand up for what's right is called dangerous? Reynolds' jaw tightened. He had spent his entire career pushing this narrative, believing in it, selling it to millions. And yet, for the first time, he could feel it slipping through his fingers. Clint's voice dropped even lower now, deadly quiet. You want to know the real problem, kid? He asked. Reynolds didn't answer. You don't believe in anything. The words hit like a hammer. Reynolds froze, completely, utterly speechless. Clint tilted his head slightly. You think you do. You think you're part of something bigger, something that matters. But the truth is, you just repeat whatever you're told to say. You don't believe in America. You don't believe in freedom. Hell, you don't even believe in yourself. The audience was on the edge of their seats. The control room was in full-blown meltdown. And Michael Reynolds? For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The cameras caught everything, the sweat forming at his temple, the way his hands clenched on the desk, the slight tremor in his jaw. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a reckoning. Clint finally leaned back, his job done. He had said everything that needed to be said, and now as he watched Reynolds sit there in stunned silence, scrambling for something, anything, to regain control, he knew the man wouldn't find it. Because Clint Eastwood had already won. Michael Reynolds sat frozen in his chair. His hands twitched as they gripped the edges of his desk. His earpiece was buzzing with frantic voices, his producers desperately feeding him anything that could salvage the situation. But there was nothing left to say. Clint Eastwood had taken control of the entire conversation. Millions of Americans watching at home had just witnessed something unprecedented. The smug, self-assured liberal host, the man who had spent years ambushing conservatives, twisting narratives, and turning interviews into public executions, was now the one bleeding out on live television. But this battle wasn't just about one host. Hollywood was watching. and they were furious. Even before Clint left the studio, the backlash had already begun. Social media was on fire. Left-wing activists, celebrities, and media elites flooded the internet with outrage. Clint Eastwood is an outdated relic. This is why the old generation needs to step aside. Dangerous rhetoric from a washed-up actor. The hit pieces were already being written. News segments dissected every word Clint had said, twisting them, reframing them, painting him as a threat. CNN ran a breaking headline, "Clint Eastwood's Toxic Views, How His Words Set America Back Decades." MSNBC followed up with, "Hollywood in Crisis, Why Clint Eastwood Must Be Held Accountable." The attacks were relentless. By the time Clint arrived home that night, he wasn't surprised. He leaned back in his chair, pouring himself a glass of whiskey as the television played the chaos unfolding. He had seen this play out before. The manufactured outrage, the desperate attempts to control the narrative, the calls for cancellation. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. His phone buzzed, a text from an old friend. "They're coming after you hard, Clint. Stay strong." Clint smirked, shaking his head. He wasn't worried. If anything, this only proved he was right. The next morning, Hollywood officially declared war. Big-name directors and actors, some Clint had even worked with, lined up to denounce him. Clint Eastwood's remarks were offensive and reckless. "I used to respect him, but this was too far. We have no room for this kind of thinking in today's America." They were trying to erase him. Studios cut ties. Sponsors distanced themselves. A major film he had been attached to was suddenly scrapped, with a vague statement about creative differences. They wanted Clint to apologize, to backtrack, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, Clint doubled down. That afternoon, he released a statement, simple, direct, unapologetic. "The truth isn't always pretty, but it's still the truth. And if telling the truth means I lose a few Hollywood friends, so be it. I never needed their approval to speak my mind, and I never will." It went viral instantly. While Hollywood elites fumed, something unexpected happened. Regular Americans started speaking up. People who had been silent for years, afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of being labeled wrong, suddenly felt emboldened. "I stand with Clint," began trending. Clips of his interview flooded every platform. People in small towns, veterans, working-class families, they all rallied behind him. Clint Eastwood just said what we've all been thinking. They're trying to silence him, just like they try to silence the rest of us. Hollywood is terrified of the truth. Suddenly, Clint wasn't just one man standing alone. He had sparked a movement. And then, the final blow came. Late that night, Clint's phone buzzed again, a message from someone he never expected. Baron Trump. "Mr. Eastwood, that was the greatest thing I've ever seen. The truth needed to be said. If you need support, I'm here." Clint raised an eyebrow, smirking. He respected that kid. Not many young men had the guts to speak up anymore. But Baron Trump wasn't just anyone. Within hours, Baron posted a video of his own. Sitting in a quiet room, wearing a suit, he looked directly into the camera and said, "Clint Eastwood is a legend. He has earned the right to speak his mind. He has done more for this country than most of the people attacking him. And if you think you can cancel him, think again." It was an earthquake. Hollywood panicked. The media scrambled. Within minutes, Baron's video had millions of views. Young people admired his boldness. Older generations saw hope in his words. And just like that, Clint's fight became something much bigger. This wasn't just about one man standing up against a corrupt industry. It was about America waking up. That night, Clint sat back, whiskey in hand, watching as the world reacted. The elites thought they could break him. Instead, they had only made him stronger. And little did they know, the real fight was just beginning. The war against Clint Eastwood had escalated. Hollywood's elite had thrown everything at him, smear campaigns, hit pieces, even old colleagues turning their backs on him. But none of it worked. The more they attacked him, the stronger he became. Now, with Barron Trump stepping in, the stakes had changed. Barron's viral video had shaken the establishment. The young man, often dismissed by the media, had proven that he wasn't just a political figure, but a formidable voice in the fight for truth. And he wasn't backing down. Then, the announcement came. Clint Eastwood and Barron Trump would sit down for a live interview together, a broadcast that would be streamed across the country, a moment that promised to be one of the most watched events in modern history. The media lost its mind. "This is dangerous," shrieked one anchor on CNN. "An alliance between the past and the future of right-wing extremism," declared another. "Why is Barron Trump aligning with a Hollywood relic?" The fear was palpable, because they knew if Clint and Barron stood side by side, it wouldn't just be a statement, it would be a revolution. The studio was packed. Rows of cameras lined the stage, a massive live audience sat waiting, and across the nation, millions tuned in. People gathered in their living rooms, in bars, in coffee shops, everywhere. This wasn't just about Clint Eastwood anymore. This was about America. Backstage, Clint Eastwood adjusted his jacket. Barron Trump stood beside him, his usual calm demeanor unwavering. For the first time in years, Hollywood wasn't in control of the narrative. Clint took a deep breath. He had been in 1,000 interviews. He had faced 1,000 battles. But tonight? Tonight was different. A producer stepped in. "You're live in 30 seconds. Clint glanced at Barron. "You ready for this, kid?" Barron smirked. "Born ready." The lights flared. The cameras rolled. The host, a well-known journalist, leaned forward, forcing a smile. He had been chosen carefully. A man known for his neutral stance. But Clint and Barron weren't fooled. This wasn't neutrality. This was another attempt to control the conversation. "Mr. Eastwood," the host began, his voice smooth but calculated, "do you regret your words?" The audience went silent. The tension was electric. Clint leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Then, with a calm and steady voice, he answered, "Why would I regret telling the truth?" The crowd erupted. The host's fake smile faltered. "Well, Mr. Eastwood," he pressed, "you have to admit, some people found your comments offensive." Clint tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Good," he said, voice firm. "The truth isn't supposed to make you comfortable. It's supposed to wake you up." The audience cheered. The host swallowed hard. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But surely," he tried again, "you understand why people feel threatened by—" Barron cut in. "Threatened by what?" His voice was sharp. "A man speaking his mind?" The host turned to Barron, attempting to regain control. "Mr. Trump," he started, "why align yourself with Clint Eastwood? He's from a different generation, a different era. Some would say his views don't reflect modern society." Barron smirked. "That's exactly why I stand with him." The host blinked. The audience leaned in. Barron continued, "My generation has been told to sit down, shut up, and follow the script, but Clint, he never followed a script, and that's why he's a legend." The room erupted in applause. The host was sweating now. This wasn't going the way he planned. "But don't you think," he pushed, "that holding on to old ideas prevents progress?" Clint chuckled. "Progress?" He shook his head. "Kid, progress means making things better, not tearing down everything that made us great in the first place." The audience roared. The host had lost control. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was a reckoning. The host took a deep breath. He had one last play. "Mr. Eastwood, you know Hollywood has condemned your comments. Many in the industry believe your time is up, that it's time for a new era." Clint smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had nothing left to prove. He leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. "Hollywood didn't make me." His voice was low, but it carried the weight of 1,000 battles. "I made Hollywood." Silence. The audience sat frozen. The host's face turned pale. Clint continued, And if you think you can erase me, you've already lost. Barron nodded beside him. You can't cancel the truth. The crowd erupted. The host was done. Across the nation, people watching at home rose to their feet. This wasn't just an interview. This was a declaration. The camera zoomed in as Clint leaned back, a faint smirk on his face. Barron looked at the host and delivered the final blow. Game over. Within minutes, clips from the interview spread like wildfire. Overtrended worldwide. Memes flooded the internet. Clint's words, "Hollywood didn't make me, I made Hollywood," were replayed millions of times. Even Clint's fiercest critics had to admit it. He had won. And Hollywood? Hollywood was terrified, because they knew Clint Eastwood wasn't just a legend. He was a movement. The interview was over, but the war had just begun. As Clint Eastwood and Barron Trump stepped off the stage, the energy in the studio was electric. The crowd had erupted into cheers. People in the audience clapped until their hands were sore, and across the country, millions of Americans watched in stunned silence. They had just witnessed something historic. Clint had done the unthinkable. He had faced down Hollywood, the media, the elites, everyone who wanted him silenced, and he had won. And now they were scrambling. The backlash was immediate. Every major news outlet ran hit pieces within minutes. Clint Eastwood's dangerous rhetoric fuels division. Why Barron Trump's support for Clint Eastwood is a threat to democracy. Hollywood turns its back on Clint Eastwood. His career is over. But there was one problem. Clint didn't care. Sitting in the back of a black SUV, he scrolled through the headlines on his phone and let out a low chuckle. "They're in full panic mode," Barron muttered beside him, smirking. Clint nodded. "That's how you know you hit 'em where it hurts." Meanwhile, across the country, the people were rising up. Clips of the interview spread like wildfire. Clint's words, "Hollywood didn't make me, I made Hollywood," became a battle cry. Memes flooded social media. T-shirts with Clint's quote sold out within hours. Americans who had felt silenced, beaten down, and ignored suddenly felt something new. Hope. Clint's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "Unknown number." He answered. "Mr. Eastwood," came the voice on the other end, deep and unmistakable. "Donald Trump." There was a brief pause, then Trump chuckled. "That was legendary, Clint." Clint smirked. "Figured it was time someone said it." "You didn't just say it," Trump replied. "You started something. The people are listening. They're awake, and they're ready." Clint exhaled slowly. He wasn't in this for fame. He wasn't in this for glory. He was in this because it mattered. Because America was worth fighting for. Trump continued, "We've got work to do, Clint. And I think America still needs to hear your voice." There was a long silence. Clint's eyes darkened with thought. Then, in a voice filled with quiet conviction, he responded, "Then let's give 'em a show." Later that night, Clint Eastwood posted a message to his supporters. "They want me gone. They want me quiet. But let me tell you something. I'm not going anywhere. The fight for America has just begun." The internet exploded. And as the world braced for what came next, one thing was clear. Clint Eastwood wasn't done, not by a long shot. Clint Eastwood's story isn't just about one man standing up against a biased media or a corrupt Hollywood machine. It's about something much bigger. It's about truth, courage, and the willingness to speak up even when the entire world tells you to sit down. In today's world, too many people are afraid of being silenced, afraid of being attacked, afraid of being canceled for simply speaking their minds. But Clint Eastwood, he wasn't afraid. He stepped onto that stage, not to play by their rules, not to bow down to their demands, but to remind America of something we should have never forgotten. That integrity doesn't have an expiration date, that principles don't go out of style, and that the truth will always be stronger than the lies. Clint Eastwood's stand is a powerful reminder that we are in a battle for the soul of this nation. The media wants control. Hollywood wants submission. The elites want power over the American people. But this story proves that they are not as powerful as they think. Because when one man, a legend, a fighter, a patriot, stood up and refused to back down, the people stood with him. They tried to cancel Clint, but instead, they made him even stronger. This moment wasn't just about Clint Eastwood. It was about all of us. It was about the millions of Americans who have been told to stay silent, to accept the lies, to let the media decide what is acceptable to believe. But Clint showed us the truth. They only have power if we let them. And now it's our turn. If this story inspired you, if it made you realize that now is the time to stand up, to fight back, to refuse to be silenced, then don't let this message stop here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because Clint Eastwood just showed us what it means to be fearless. Now the question is, will you join him?